is Chris Kurzik from the Bandura system. This video is an in-depth discussion about strings. As you see, there are a lot of strings on a Bandura, and there are a lot of choices for strings on a Bandura. And this discussion will get into the types of strings, the materials, and the issues associated with strings, including how pitch is determined with strings. I hope you enjoy this video and find it interesting.
Okay, starting from the fundamentals, what are musical strings? A musical string is a specific length of flexible wire that is held under tension by a musical instrument, such that it can freely vibrate at a specific pitch when struck. String sound is produced by means of vibration. Stringed instruments can be played by plucking the instrument with fingers, such as a bandura or a harp, or with a pick, as per a guitar. Other types of instruments produce sounds when they are struck with a wooden hammer, such as a piano, or by rubbing the strings with a violin bow. All strings are described in terms of a gauge. What is a gauge? Well, it's the string thickness or string outside diameter measured in terms of 1/1000th of an inch. A string diameter is expressed in decimal in inches terms. So a 0.010 inch diameter string is expressed as a 10 gauge. And the gauge system is an imperial-based system. Music strings are analogous to a spring. A large string diameter, the greater the force is required to pluck the string. Using the proper size string or gauge ensures sound quality. Heavier gauge strings are more durable and less susceptible to breakage. Heavier gauge also have less tendency to buzz and are louder than light gauge strings. I'm going to direct your attention to the diagram on the left. This is a typical guitar string that you can use for your bandura. On the upper left side is the diameter expressed in millimeters of the string. On the right, it says Leo or LE013, which is a 13 gauge string. So banduras use metal strings, and there's basically two types of strings that are used: plain strings and wound strings. A little bit about plain strings. They're also known as piano wire, unwound strings, spring steel, or music wire. Modern banduras utilize steel strings. And why? Because for their bright tone. However, there are several types of materials available for strings, and it can be quite confusing. What you want to use is recommended is following an acoustic string. Plain strings are also based on the following factors: the gauge, which you talked about earlier, which is an expression of the thickness of the string, the string metal, and the coating and plating on a string. The diagram on the left shows a typical wrapping of a plain string, and it's a steel string with a coating on it, a tin coating to prevent corrosion. Wound strings are the second most common string found on the Bandura. Wound strings are composite materials consisting of a wrapping of typically bronze and with a steel core. And they are typically used for the lower bass notes. Now, why do they use wound strings? Why can't they just use plain strings for everything? Well, metal wound strings are used for banduras because they enable strings to be made of less thickness, which makes lower pitched strings easier to play. If they didn't use these wound strings, then the thickness of the string would be quite large. It'd be like a cable, and it would be quite difficult to play. So this is a way around having lower pitched strings. Wound strings enable builders to use shorter, thicker strings to produce the lowest pitch bass notes. More about string cores. There are two types of string cores. There's a round core and a hexagonal core. There's a diagram on the left side which shows you the cross section of what a round core string looks like. Notice that the core shown in blue has almost complete contact with the string winding, whereas the hexagonal core has point contact with the windings. Now let's compare these two types of cores that you'll find being sold on the market for strings. And the most prevalent nowadays is the hexagonal, which is the more commonly produced because it's one of the big reasons it's easier to manufacture. It's easier for the windings to grab onto the string and hold in place. The round string is a more traditional string. This is what the older strings you'll see are more wound, and but they're more flexible than the more modern hexagonal string. The tone is a consistent tone, is because there's more contact surface, and the hexagonal cone has a more inconsistent tone because of the gaps between the contact surface. That's why you see some traditional guitarists or string instrument players, they prefer a round instrument or a round core, so that they feel it's a more pure sound. The round core has a gentler attack, and hexagonal has a sharper attack, which is desirable in some cases. The hexagonal is more of a sustaining tone. It will last longer than a round core, which sustaining is a nicer feature as well. Now a little bit more about wound strings, if there wasn't enough already. There are three types of windings. Okay, there's called a round wound, which is your traditional winding. You got your ground wound and your flat wound. The later two, the ground wound and the flat wound, are more for electric guitars, and the round wound is more for acoustic guitars. Now, the ground wound and the flat wound, some musicians prefer that because there's less chance of getting debris or sweat into the strings, where there's less chance of degradation. Round wounds, they can get debris stuck into the grooves a little easier, but a round wound is a more traditional sound, and it's recommended for Bandura players. Like for myself, a musician needs to feel the string, and the grooves on the string help the musician locate the strings. Another feature about when you listen to a round wound versus a ground wound is there's a little bit of a squeak with a round wound, and with a ground wound it's more of a smoother sound. Some musicians prefer to have that squeak sound than a ground sound, depending on what the musician wants. Now, going back to the string types, now you go down to the music store, look for strings or online, and you're going to see they're going to ask you, do you want an acoustic string or an electric string? Well, these are the two broad groupings. Remember that an electric string needs to have a magnetic signature in order for it to work. So electric strings are made out of materials that are magnetic, not necessarily very good for acoustic. I've tried electric strings on a Bandura, doesn't sound as good. Acoustic string, we recommend just when you order replacement strings, make sure you get an acoustic style string. You can't go wrong. Now, guitar, one of the things is why there's so many choices is guitar technology has really driven innovation, all this competition in string materials, technology, configurations, and so on. And modern Bandura strings utilize a lot of this metal guitar technology. Strings have been developed, because of these two broad groups. So once again, stay with acoustic strings and you can't go wrong. Now, for acoustic strings, there are three broad groups. There's the phosphor bronze, which is our number one recommendation. And then there's the 80-20 bronze, which is the ancestor or the father of the phosphor bronze string. And then there's a newer technology called an aluminum bronze string. And all these strings refer to the winding around the steel core. So the phosphorus bronze string is our number one recommendation because the string lasts longer, but it lasts longer than an 80-20 bronze string, and it's better technology. The phosphor bronze is slightly warmer compared to bronze strings, the 80-20. Traditionalists' older strings will be made out of 80-20 bronze strings, and so traditionalists prefer it, but the cost is that it will lose its brightness relatively quicker than the phosphor bronze string. Now, a new string is called an aluminum bronze, and I admit that I haven't tried that much because I'm happy with phosphor bronze, but it has the advantage of being more corrosion resistant, and hence it can, in theory, last longer, and the manufacturers claim it has great sustainability and tonal response. I'm going to talk about coatings because that's another thing with strings that you find. They put coatings on strings to reduce the wear and the corrosion on a string, because the more product and corrosion on a string, the more uneven the string gets, and then the quality of the sound drops. So manufacturers market their coatings and platings to musicians because they say that the coatings will last longer. So plain strings have an anti-rust tin coating that's been added to the plain strings in order to provide corrosion resistance. And how that's done is the strings are dipped in a hot bath of tin and then wiped off. And that's all there is to it. And it keeps the strings from corroding, and it does a nice job. Now, the wound strings are more complicated. There are a lot of systems out there. And the big one is called a polymer coated string, and it reduces the wear on the string from the fingers of the musician and the picks or whatever they use, and it also reduces the squeaking that is found on wound strings. Now, the the trick is that these coatings have to be very, very thin so that it doesn't reduce the tonal response. There are people that think that these strings coatings are excellent, and there's others that don't care for them. That's up to you, but I tend to not use these kind of strings. Now, a few things about preservation, strings and preservation. It's always a great idea to preserve your strings and always keep extra strings. So keep those silica gel packages and store your strings in a tin, and they'll last a lot longer. I mean, in a dry, cold climate like in Canada, it's not much of an issue. But if you're in a hot, warmer, humid climate, your strings will degrade with time. Some manufacturers will actually package their strings in a sealed, basically a sealed bag, and they put nitrogen in it to prevent the strings from degrading. And the whole idea is you don't want the strings to degrade because it reduces the quality of the sound. So when to change strings? Big question. We've talked a lot about strings and when to change strings. Well, one advantage that a Bandura has over a guitar is the strings on a guitar are used more frequently than a Bandura string. A Bandura strings aren't hit nearly as often, so in theory, a Bandura strings will last longer than a guitar string. So here's some tips about when to change strings, and that depends on a lot of factors. On the left is basically a diagram of the amplitude versus frequency, and if the string will stay sharp, it will have a response like the yellow line, and when it starts to wear down, it'll have more like the red line. So the upper frequency starts to drop. So the change in frequency does not stay tuned. So when you tune it, it doesn't stay tuned, and it doesn't stay like a clean sound that you want, what they call a sustained sound. The sound sounds flat or dull because it's losing its flatness. And when you touch the string, it feels dirty. And if you look at it closely, you'll see some discoloration. The string becomes discolored due to accumulation of debris and corrosion products on the windings. You can use alcohol-based cleaner, and that will give you some temporary relief, but it won't solve the problem. And the big one, though, is if you start to see windings fray and the string starting to unwind, then it's definitely time to change the string. The last thing you want is to have the string being inconsistent along its length, because that reduces the quality of the sound. And of course, if your string buzzes, that's another big issue. Now, I have a number of string manufacturers that we've used through the years, and the list is shown here. We've got Black Diamond, the Adrio, DR, Ernie Ball, very common, Fender, HGS, La Bella, and Martin. These are all big manufacturers of strings. Try them and see what you think. And the quality's gotten better over the years. Now, pure or more hardcore musicians will tend to go to Europe to get their strings. Pyramid, Optima, made in Germany, Tomatic Infeld of Vienna, they make probably the best strings. Musicians that are really seeking like excellent quality will go to them, but you're paying a premium. but they offer all kinds of interesting strings. They tend to go with round core strings, and they're more traditional, and the cost is higher, and some of them offer silver plated strings and gold plated strings. Interested in learning more? Place your order for the Bandura Musician Handbook or subscribe to this Bandura System channel. And we are a proud member of the League of Skilled Bandura Players. And we look forward to our future episodes, and I look forward to any comments that you may have. Bye for now.